Hello, everyone. I'm David Harvey. I'm your DC Post First Vice President. I want to thank you here for joining us today. Um, we have a number of registrants from all over the country. We have looks over close to 30 participants now. I'm sure more will be joining. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our September First Friday Luncheon session featuring Ryan Searles from IMEG, who will be sharing security design considerations for an active shooter event. Our new First Friday session is provided to you through SAME's commitment to offering the AEC community effective training and development and networking programs. The SAME DC Post is helping sustain the future of the profession with these monthly education focused sessions to deliver topical and relevant content to our industry. Thank you for joining us here today as we start the program. So, so it's on the next slide, we'll see the agenda for today. First, if you have your video on, see maybe leave the videos off, make sure you're muted. And if you have questions, you can use the chat to put that in at any time, and feel free to eat your lunch since it's lunchtime here on the East Coast, or your breakfast. Um, Great. So first, we'll like take a moment of silence to remember our active duty military, first responders, and all who need our care and thoughts throughout the world right now. All right, thank you. So I'd like to please join us in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I'd like to take a moment to thank our DC Post sponsors for your support: AMT, Black and Veatch, Christopher Consultants, Consigli, Gannett Fleming, Spinoli, Stantec, WSP, Jacobs, Woods Peacock, AB Facilities Service Solutions, and Arche Consulting. We truly appreciate your support. We couldn't put on these events without you, and we're grateful for your outstanding sponsorship. Your support helps us meet our society's goals, including providing excellent content from our members, industry, and government engagement, building resilient communities, connecting with our future leaders through our student and young members groups, enriching the STEM pipeline, and preparing our military and veterans for life after the service. If you're not already a DC Post sponsor and would like to support our post with annual sponsorship, we would love to add your name to this list for future programs and events this year. Please visit our website for more information about sponsorship levels and how you can give back to your community through the DC Post sponsorship. All right, well, now it's time for our main program. Um, Please note that this program will provide one professional development hour from the SAME DC Post. You'll be looking in your emails from SAME and the Eventbrite with a copy of the program slides and your PDH certificate. We're also recording this session, and that will be sent to you in an email with those links as well. So as you can see here, the learning objectives, you can peruse those yourselves. What I'm going to do is introduce Ryan Searles. And also, while I'm doing this, if you can feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat, let us know where you're from. And if you have questions, you can type them in there as well, and we'll get to those at the end of the session. Uh, Ryan Searles brings more than 17 years of professional experience in the field, security, force protection, and risk management for multiple jurisdictional responses in local, state, regional, and national levels. He has led tactical teams of 90 plus in dynamic, fast-paced environments and possesses a comprehensive background in complex problem solving and relationship building derived from conducting domestic and global operations across 5 continents. Ryan has managed enterprise-wide risk management programs to protect life and safety, critical infrastructure, property, and equipment. His extensive knowledge includes public policy, OSHA, workplace violence, active shooter response training, project management, and incident commander system applications. So, all right. Well, thank you, Ryan. Welcome today. I'd like to turn the program over to you for your presentation.
Sounds great. Thank you. I'll go ahead and share my screen here. All right. Can everybody see that? Okay. So today, important topic, definitely hits close to home. Um, Active shooters in the United States aren't stopping. They're going to keep going. It's not a if, it's a when. So we need to be prepared for it. A lot of what we do, and my background with my company is we design to help prevent these, right? We know nothing's 100%, but it's all about mitigation and what we can do to mitigate. So just going forward, just a little bit background on IMEG. Engineering firm, we're across the country, work with a lot of different people. The big thing with this is, whether it's K through 12, higher ed, healthcare, whatever sector you're working in, we're seeing active shooters in all different realms. Um, Kind of the newer thing in the past 5 years, I would say, that have picked up a lot is public space. So even when we're designing now public spaces, places of leisure, thing like that, we also have to include active shooter in the considerations for preparing for an event and designing for an event to happen. There's a lot of different things that go into this. It's not just we're going to put some film on glass and we're good. We got to do all sorts of different things. It may start with your vulnerability gap analysis. Where are we vulnerable? Where are our gaps? How do we close those gaps? How do we address them? And moving forward from there. And we really need to start doing that. um so it's kind of a big thing that we need to prepare for, and we need to consider all angles, not just one or two. um and really consider everything. So you guys heard enough about me. We don't need to do any more of that. It's always weird having someone else tell people about me. But so really, here we go, right? What is the true definition of an active shooter? And this is important to know because we hear active shooter on the news all the time, and they're not always active shooter events. The press will push that out there and just throw that term around when they're not. And it's very important from the design side to know the true definition because we have to design for that. So the true definition of an active shooter is an individual actively engaged in killing or attempting to kill people in a confined and populated area. All right. Oftentimes there is no pattern or method to their selection of victims as well. Now I say that with the caveat of most active shooter events, a lot of them start off as targeted and then move to random selection of victims. When you look at K through 12, and that targeting will be different, right? So when you look at education, a lot of times it is that Uvalde Elementary, random selection. More high school, you may have the selection be the the person that turned down from prom. You have more bullying selection then. You have different things like that. With workplace, places of commerce, you have HR is usually targeted because, Billy's late 37 days in a row. It's not Billy's fault he gets terminated, it's HR's. So you'll see HR get targeted. You'll see supervisors, things like that. So we have to understand that the active shooter events may start off as targeted and then move to random selection. Um, so on the news saying they'll throw that term around, let's say there's a person that goes into McDonald's and wants to rob McDonald's for burgers, doesn't get their burgers and starts shooting a bunch of people on their way out. They'll say that's an active shooter event. It's not. It's a robbery gone wrong. So an active shooter, and that what differs is the intent. The intent was initially to go in and get burgers or whatever they're trying to get. The only intent of an active shooter is to cause as much harm as possible. And we need to be able to tell the difference between the two because the design is different. I work a lot with banks sometimes, and it's they try to use their robbery protocol for their active shooter, and we can't do that. We have to specifically design and prepare for active shooter events. Now, what type of things should we be considering really with the design? I look at most security situations in preparation as really three different areas. We have the prevention, right? What can we do to mitigate? That can involve all sorts of things. That can be the systems we're putting in. What are we doing for systems? Do we have gunshot detection? Do we have cameras? Do we have access control? What are we doing for visitor management system? Everything we're doing in our design to put into buildings. The design, what are we utilizing for Sept, which is crime prevention through environmental design? Am I creating that natural surveillance where we can see someone coming into our building on approach that may have a weapon and give us an early warning system? How are we creating our territorial boundaries and our lighting? Lighting's huge. We know that for design. I've always said, darkness empowers bad people to do bad things. So how are we lighting up areas to deny terrain? Big thing now is single point of entry. You're seeing that with a lot of not just education, K through 12 and higher ed, but businesses are going to that, government's going to that. Is how do we design for single point of entry? We can do that, right, to funnel people through one way where we know they're coming in and we can kind of harden that area. But there's some considerations in there too, right? If we're doing single point of entry, are we now funneling first responders just into one area? Or do they have other avenues of approach? If we have a mass casualty incident, do we have enough egress or ingress to be able to evac casualties? Where's our triage going? How do we treat casualties? All that. So we can do single point of entry, but we have to look at what else that's affecting and really target hardening. How are we hardening our buildings with the design to prevent an active shooter or violent event from occurring inside your area? So that's really the prevention piece. Now, we know prevention, we can mitigate a whole bunch. Let's say we can mitigate 80% of an event happening, but that's not 100%. We can never be 100% closed. We know that. So if an event does happen, that's our response. So we got prevention, then an event happens. What is our response? There's a lot that goes into that response, which is also design. How are we creating our hallways, right? How are we designing hallways? How are we designing classrooms? How are we designing doorways and entryways, thresholds? Can we design them certain ways to mitigate an active shooter from gaining entry? So we have to look at response to an attack and then post event. Post event's the last. How do we get back up and operational? And is our design helping with that post event? Is it helping with the law enforcement response, the EMS response? Is it hurting that? How have we now, slowed down a response by our design? And then, there's different post events for standing up. If it's healthcare, how do we get back up operational and serving our community again right away? If it's business, how do we get back up operational and profitable again right away? So we got to look at those different post events, and a lot of that goes into your emergency management and training of your personnel inside the buildings, and having an incident command team and all those elements that go inside the post event area. Now, what is physical security design? Well, design is really an effective physical security system is a very methodical approach, and it's a very layered approach. I like to start at the perimeter and work my way in, and I'll talk about that further on in the class. But it really is a methodical approach. Just someone slapping up cameras everywhere isn't physical security. Um, you can utilize cameras for tons of types of events. There's live monitoring. There's just looking at it for post event for reporting. um, there's different uses of cameras, but really to have a good system, it's going to be a whole integrated of cameras, access control, lighting, mass communication, gunshot detection, all these different systems, right? So when we're designing buildings, a lot of times I'll go in right away and say, okay, what does my building look like? How have we designed this? What systems work the best? And you really have to pick those ones that integrate very well with it. Um, and then breaking away from systems, physical security systems is one part, but you have the people. How are we training our personnel? How often are we training? What type of training are we doing? What types of policy and procedures do we have in place? All sorts of things. It is a full, I always say 540. I know military 360 is a big thing. I always say 540, 360 degrees around me and 180 up and above. So we got to look at that whole picture of what is everything we need to do, not just slapping a camera on the wall. Um, what really does that mean? What's the application for active shooter? There's a lot of systems with physical security and with training your personnel and all that that can really mitigate loss of life, and we know that. Um, putting a duress button that goes to law enforcement with our design at the front desk in case an active shooter comes in, they hit that button and that's what we designed it for, and they're good to go. No, it is very unlikely that if an active shooter comes in, that person is sitting there, staying there, and hitting that button. Human response, they're going to respond. They're going to get up and run. So, what systems are we integrating to really help with an active shooter? Is that gunshot detection in there, which takes that human error away? There's a lot of stuff on the market that within 3 seconds, a gunshot is fired. It is notifying your internal mass communication. It's notifying law enforcement. It's doing all of these different things. So there's a lot we can do with physical security design and how it relates to active shooter response. With assessments of the design and buildings, we have to definitely look at what are our threats. What are our known threats? What are our unknown threats? A lot of times, an active shooter can be an unknown threat. I still get in the United States all the time when I work with these companies or consult for these companies that have had active shooter events. I still hear all the time, "Well, we didn't think it would happen here." Well, why not? Why are we still thinking that way? We know they're happening everywhere, but most organizations are thinking, well, we're not going to have an active shooter. We'll have something else will happen, a fire, weather event, something like that. So a lot of times people consider active shooters an unknown threat, but we still have to consider it and we still have to prepare for it. That's something we definitely have to do. They are happening everywhere. Vulnerability gap analysis are very important to do for clients and for your internal agencies themselves. And vulnerability gap is really, where are my gaps? What are they? How do I address them? How do I close them? And a lot of times doing a vulnerability gap analysis also helps establish budget and prioritize what type of projects need to be completed. Um, Really, and how can this help? Well, it gets you better organized. It's just like doing tabletop exercises, right? It shows us where our gaps are. It shows us what we're missing, and then we can close those and go back again and redo them, and hopefully close more gaps. And we just need to keep doing this stuff so we become safer organizations and we design safer for organizations. And then down at the bottom, I have the whole part of really look at what do you have for prevention, what are you doing with design for that response? And then how are we aiding in the post event with our design work? So, really, security considerations within design, whether it's in the CD phase, DD phase, whatever we're doing, you're seeing more firms that are actually getting consultants involved a lot earlier in the process, which is a good thing. It's showing me that the United States is, the United States as a whole has always been very reactive instead of proactive. Um, a lot of times it takes an event like Uvalde or Columbine, Newtown, you name it, to spike the interest, and all of a sudden there's a need, right? And it's almost like a roller coaster. We see this ramp up period where an event happens and everybody starts designing for active shooter. We start doing stuff to prepare for them, and then it starts going downhill again as it gets farther away because we're on to the next shiny thing that's on social media or on the news or whatever. And we need to become more proactive in when I'm seeing firms, especially architectural firms that are getting consultants involved way earlier on the security design. That's awesome. That's showing me we're starting to become more proactive and looking at these events and really starting to prepare and design for them. So that's a good thing. Um, we've had some stuff happen the past however long, 10 years, where the United States has just been going nuts. So, we've had civil unrest, we've had the stuff at the Capitol building, we've had more active shooter events, we've had all sorts of different things. And I think that's also really spurred the need for security consultants to get involved and help with the design because it really is on the mind of a lot of people. How do we prevent these from happening? What kind of places, what kind of barriers can we put in place to mitigate? And that's a good thing, but we need to be able to look at that and be realistic and say, we do need to start preparing for these type of things. Now, with our design, um, we definitely realize not all buildings are the same. As much as I would like to make our schools look like a prison, so they're super safe, I can't do that, and I know that. The same with hospitals and healthcare. You're seeing more active shooter events in healthcare systems as well. But those types of structures need to keep their look and their purpose. So, in K through 12 higher ed, it needs to look like an educational institution. It doesn't need to look like a prison. A healthcare facility. A lot of people, if you're going to a hospital and you have to walk through a bunch of metal detectors and all sorts of stuff, it's not a friendly experience. So, and it can slow patient care, it can affect all sorts of different things. So we really need to consider those when we're designing of, okay, what market am I dealing with? What sector am I dealing with? And how do I really design? Um, we can definitely do some very creative things to help within education and healthcare. So it still keeps its look it needs to keep and function, but it's still safer. There's a lot of things we can do to start making structures and buildings safer for kids, for patients, for customers, all sorts of things, and we need to consider that. But we also know from a design aspect and from the security consultant aspect that there are differences within the markets, and we have to design for those different markets. Um, One thing I like to do with my design is I always like to start with the perimeter and the property line and work my way in. I'm a big advocate of Sept. I use Sept a lot in my design. So I like to start with that territorial boundaries. How do we, make the difference between public and private space? Where does our property line start? How do we do that? What kind of fencing are we using? What kind of lighting are we using? What kind of vegetation are we using? No vegetation should be higher than 2 feet, and no tree branch should be lower than 6. That way, we create good lines of sight and natural surveillance. So I saw someone in the chat said define Septet. So Septet is crime prevention through environmental design. It deals with natural surveillance, natural access control, lighting, territorial boundaries, wayfinding, traffic curbing, all sorts of different things. But it's the natural way we can do things within in the design. Now, SEPTED by itself is not the know all be all. You have to do a layered approach. So SEPTED layered with your electronic, layered with your preparation of your personnel, all those they really go together. It is a total 10,000-foot look and approach to mitigating issues. Um, with the prevention and mitigation and design, I always think of it as a filter, right? What percentage of issues can we really mitigate before it even gets to us? So I look at that property and perimeter line in the design and say, okay, can I mitigate maybe 10% of stuff getting to my parking lot? Now, parking lot, how are we designing our parking lots? What kind of lighting are we having? Are we adding lighting? How much space do we have before lighting? Do we have barriers in our parking lots because we've planted a bunch of big bushes and all sorts of stuff and we can't see around them, so we don't know if someone's on the other side with a gun or if someone's approaching our building with a weapon? So can we stop another 20% in our parking lots? Then once it gets to our door, what can we stop there? With ballistic glazing and all sorts of different things. And I really look at the design aspect of security as it's a filter, and it has to be a layered approach. Um, I have underneath it, this isn't just fencing. A lot of people, and I'm seeing it more and more. I'll talk about it on another slide, but they just throw fencing up and they're like, okay, now we're safe. We're good. We can't do that. It is a total approach. All right. But once we get inside, we're looking at different design aspects of how are we creating natural access control to funnel people certain ways that we want them to go with our design. How are we creating our vestibules, our front desk areas? How are those designed? I still go into buildings where the receptionist or the front desk person can't even see over the desk. We got to look at that. A lot of times that front desk person is your first line of defense, and they're going to be the first ones to notify people. They have to be able to see. And then what technologies can we use inside that can really help prevent and respond? So the almighty dollar, cost is a huge thing, right? It's always budget. We always run into that. What's our budget for this? A lot of times getting security involved early on in your design can really help save budget. It doesn't cost as much, and it creates a safer building, especially when we're trying to design to help with active shooter events. If we get involved late in the design process, there's really not much I can do. I've been brought into schools and healthcare facilities and stuff like that once it's already been designed and built, and they're like, "All right, make it safe." It's like, well, I can't change anything. I can slap up some cameras and slap up some technologies, but that's it. So getting involved early really helps with cost because then you don't have to change anything. Um, it also helps with the selection of cohesive systems that work the best within your design to prevent active shooters or other types of emergencies. So that also helps a ton. And then it gives us the ability to adjust. I got involved with a school not too long ago, helping with the design of an elementary school, and I got brought in late. And you had a clear line of sight from the second floor into the lunchroom, right? And we know numerous active shooter events have happened in lunchrooms because it's an area of mass gathering. It's I hate to say it this way, but it's a target-rich environment, and the active shooters know that. Um, so we can't have someone that can shoot from the second floor straight down into the lunchroom with clear lines of sight. The building had already been framed up and built up, so I had to work with the interior designer to say, okay, how do we obscure this view? And we ended up hanging a bunch of flags of different colleges and stuff like that that the kids could look at for, future going to schools. And it served its purpose. It obscured the view from the second floor into the lunchroom. But so if I would have gotten involved earlier, I could have adjusted more with the design to do that. We still were able to cover it, but if we start early on into the design with mitigation in mind for an active shooter or other events, it really gives us the ability to adjust and somewhat change design. Um, I know that it's definitely I don't want to completely change the design. A good security consultant, it's not up to me to change the design of the building. It's up to me to work within the design of the building. So I understand that, buildings need to look good and they have their aesthetics and they need to serve their purpose. I understand that completely. But we also need to know that we need to make our buildings safe because of active shooter events and other type of events. So we may want to, keep the aesthetics and do stuff like that. But number one mission always has to be life safety with our designs is how are we preserving life? How are we mitigating active shooter events? How are we doing these types of things? Um, if we design a beautiful building that is dangerous, does it hurt us in the future? If you think of Columbine, whenever anybody says Columbine, all they'll think of is that active shooter. Whenever anybody says Uvalde now, all they'll think of is that active shooter. Um, and that really tarnished the brand. And Columbine has an amazing football program that goes to state almost every year. They have awesome educational institutions. Uvalde here in Texas. I actually have family members that are in the Uvalde school district. I go hunting in Uvalde all the time. It is an awesome small town. But from now on, whenever anybody hears that, they're always going to think of those active shooter events. So if we design a building that really is open and dangerous and vulnerable, and an active shooter event happens, does that tarnish our brand? Do people think of us when an event happens? So these are all things to consider of how we design and how we protect our brand and our people and everything. So systems to consider within design. Um, Fencing. I told you earlier, a lot of people I see are just slapping up fences and going, "Oh, we're good now." I call it the castle model, where they almost wall themselves in. Um, we have to consider with fencing. Fencing can also hurt. As long as fencing is designed the right way, it's fine. But most people are not designing it the right way. They're doing single point of entry on fencing, and that doesn't help. We are now keeping, let's say we wall in a school, right? We're designing a school and we put a fence all around it and now it's safe. Well, I mean, the number one aspect of active shooter is avoid the active shooter. So we're actually teaching at the National Center to get kids out of the area. Get out of the school. If you can get out, run, come back when there's 10,000 cop cars around it, right? If we fence in the whole school, can kids get out? Also, are we now funneling law enforcement into one area? Can law enforcement approach from other ends? Do they have to ram down the fence if they can with their patrol vehicles? Um, if we get all of these vehicles, I'm sure you guys have seen the news of how many actual patrol vehicles show up to an active shooter event because it's local, state, federal, county, everybody with their mother and a gun and a badge is showing up to an active shooter event. So there's tons of vehicles. Well, if we only have one point of entry through that fencing, and we've designed it that way, is there room for the ambulances? Are we slowing down evac? Right? Where do we triage outside of the building? How do we get casualties to the ambulances? So we got to consider all those things when we're designing buildings with the fencing. There's cons and pros to it. We just have to design it the right way. Lighting, I talked about that earlier. It's huge. Um, Very important aspect is to make sure we have well lit areas. Cameras, a lot of time, can be an early warning system of people on the approach. Access controls, awesome as well. Now, with access control, I have done stuff with design where organizations are like, well, we just want access control so we can keep bad people out. Well, you got to understand when it comes to places of commerce, over 81% of the time, an active shooter has a relationship with the location. So there's a good chance that person's going to have a badge, right? They may have a badge to scan into that access control. So there's stuff like that we need to consider of how are we doing access control. Mass communication is great for systems. It lets everybody know if there's employees out away from our building and an active shooter's happening, it can send a message. They know not to come back to the building. If people are in a different area of a campus where there's multiple buildings, they know to either do a lockdown or lock out, depending on what they're doing. And then gunshot detection's another great system. It really helps pick up that gunshot and notify law enforcement right away. You can even integrate it in with your access control and your cameras, so they work together, and you can integrate it with mass communication. There's some active or gunshot detection systems that actually work as a mass communication as well, so that really helps also. Now, other things to consider with design, not just the technology, right? It's what types of locks are we using? That's a huge thing. It can get active shooter response and preparation and design does not need to be complicated. We need to realize what the human response is, though, to an active shooter and how our design can help them respond. We know that under stress, at even 90 beats per minute in your heart rate, you start losing fine motor skills. So, if we're designing buildings where someone has to perform a lockdown by putting a key into a lock and turning it, they're probably not going to be able to do that because their fine motor skills are diminishing. I always, condition red, which is in the military, we used to do this, and after the military, I did some funny work here and there where they would study. And condition red is about 120 beats per minute in your heart. Um, Under that condition, naturally in your body, you're stronger, you're faster, you'll bleed less when you're shot, and your gross motor skills are in peak performance. We know that happens in the body naturally. So gross motor skills are in peak performance. So design a lock that involves a gross motor skill. Even those push buttons on doors, they can slap them. That's a gross motor movement, and it locks the door. The foot locks at the bottom, where they can do a deadbolt into the ground. All they have to do is step on it. That's a gross motor skill. That's an easy lock to lock down a door. And then what types of doors are we using? That's huge. We love to use glass in design now. I know that I call them fish bowls, and that's not safe. It looks nice, but it's not safe. So, what types of doors are we using? We know to date, no active shooter has ever breached a solid core door. A door that's locked has never been breached. That's a solid core door. So, what are we doing for doors? What types of doors are we using? Where are we putting them? Are they inward opening? Are they outward opening? Well, I know The fire code has some to say about that with occupancy of rooms, but if we can have inward opening doors, way better than outward opening doors. Um, Window type, secondary exit points are great for active shooter response. So, are we putting windows in external classrooms, hospital systems, stuff like that, where people can break them and get out of the building if they need to? We need to consider secondary exit points for active shooter response within our design. And then, really, if we're just putting windows and they're super high and we can't get out of them, that doesn't work. So, we need to consider height. We need to consider window type, what type of glass, external windows, internal windows in our building. What are we doing for those? How are we designing those? And I brought up already the fishbowl where it's just glass everywhere. It's hard to stop and prevent anything. So, kind of the method I look at for response is, and I didn't create this. I didn't recreate the wheel on this. This is something DHS and FEMA uses. That picture you see, the mitigation, prevention, preparedness, response, and then recovery. And I break it down into three parts: more of the prevention, response, and post event, which recovery would go over post event. But this is really what we're doing, right? Is how do we do this? How does our design help in this? How do we prepare for active shooters? And what can we really design to make this wheel work? So another aspect, when we're talking to clients with design, a lot of times, we're right in front of clients, is things to ask them like, "Hey guys, we're designing this building super safe for you. We're putting these measures in place. However, we can only mitigate a certain amount. What are you guys doing for training? What type of training are you doing? How often are you doing it?" Yeah, I've worked at the National Center for Active Shooter for years. I've had the privilege of helping co-author some of the national standards. Um, and that's a big thing is, guys, what type of training are you using? How often are you doing it? If we just do active shooter once a year, is that enough? Probably not. Does it check the block for more of an awareness training? Sure. But we need to train people more and more. When we were in schools, we always we always did fire drills, right? When you went to school. Why? A teacher never sat behind you, I guarantee you, lit a fire and went, figure it out. No, they drilled you ahead of time so you knew what hallway to go out of, what door to go out of, where your rally point was, all that. We have to do that with our employees for active shooter response as well. All right. We have to be able to condition their minds so under stress, they know how to respond. Training is super important aspect of preparing for an active shooter. I always say training and preparedness is really what protects our employees, our staff, and our clients. Excuse me. Um, but the policy and procedure is really what helps us liability wise. All right. We really have to get that policy and procedure down for active shooter response and mitigation. One, it's going to be our stepping stones of how do we respond, but it's also going to really protect us. And it helps our employees. Let's say they're not there for the day of training. They can look back at policy and procedure and see how we respond. The other big thing I talk to our clients about is, when we're setting up their design, setting up their buildings, doing all that to protect them, is do they have a crisis management team? That's a huge aspect. How do you run an event? Yeah, law enforcement's going to respond and take over the crime scene, and it's going to be their scene. However, we still have to respond as people inside, taking care of our own employees and our staff. So, do you have that crisis management team stood up? Do they know what to do? Are they training? Are they responding? So we have to be able to form those teams, and that can really help if you have all of these things, the design down, and all of that can greatly, greatly mitigate loss of life in an active shooter event. Our number one responsibility is safety and security of our clients. Bottom line, we have to design safe buildings, and we have to really consider active shooter events when we're considering these. Having that specialized security consultant that really helps with the design really can help set you apart as a firm and really help design a nice, great building that keeps its looks and it's super safe. So, um, with that, we know active shooters aren't going to stop. We know we have to design, we have to prepare for them. Um, I really hope this helped with seeing the different systems, knowing what's out there, and really giving you guys some really good considerations for safe building design as it relates to active shooter events. So, thank you very much all for listening, and I will turn it over to you guys.
All right, thanks, Ryan. We had over 45 people joining here today. Want to thanks for your insights on this important topic. Something that facility managers, designers, and the industry needs to contemplate, considering the status of the environment in which we're living. Um, I want to thank everyone for participating today. We really appreciate your time. Um, and before we wrap up the program, I'd like to share with you some of our upcoming events. So please mark your calendar for the local post events as well as upcoming SME DC national events. We're committed to bringing you more content and more fun events for the rest of the year. So please visit our post page. It's the SAME.org uh, /DC post. I think there's some slides here that are going to show you where it's the next session. Our next first Friday session is Maria Pincelli from Mercator and English. And the topic there is teaming, joint ventures, and mentor protege relationships on federal set aside contracts. And would like to ask if you have a educational topic you'd like to present on during the first Friday's lunch session. There's a form online on our website that you can fill out to submit that. We're booking the calendar year starting for 2023 right now, and we're looking forward to hosting experts in their industry with insights ranging from technical topics to marketing and business development topics. So go ahead and let us know what you'd like to present there. Um, Join us next weekend for a fun Team River Runner Family Day with the DC Post, Mid Maryland Post, and I think that's the DBIA Mid Atlantic region. It's a kayaking and potluck on the picnic on the Potomac. There it is. It's September 11th, 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Uh, that's where that event's going to be taking place. Next Thursday, the 29th, is going to be another event. Oops, there it is right there. Uh, Networking at Capo DC. It's I've been to that one. It's pretty good. I'll probably be at that one as well. It's located in U Street, downtown DC. Make some new connections there and meet the DC Post members. It's a great event. Also, then on October 5th is going to be a charity scholarship of golf event that's coming. It's going to be over at Joint Base Andrews. So still having registration for there. There's different cost tiers depending on kind of what if you're in the government or in private industry or just kind of want to show up. Um, should be a good event. I'm going to be out there hitting the balls into the weeds. You can join me there for that. Um, so I think there's a couple slides here. There's a small business conference that's coming up in November as well in Nashville, and then I think there's another list of other upcoming events here. There's the Top Golf, and then there's going to be a banquet, military awards banquet in the, the holiday. The golf is going to be in December 6th, and then rolling into the next calendar year, service award banquets, and then there's going to be a small business conference in April 20 of 2023. All right, so so you can see there's a lot of programs going on here for the rest of the year and more educational events. So please continue to stay tuned. All right. Well, I want to thank everyone again. I don't know if there's any questions that popped up. Is there any questions we can see here?
Yeah, there's a bunch of different questions if
Yeah.
you want me to start answering some of
So
those.
let's roll down. Yeah, let's roll down those questions.
Okay.
Ryan, if you want to
Um,
see, I'm trying to scroll through them here. I can read them.
here,
Uh,
here we go. I have one right here. So
Okay.
instead, a lot of schools around here are going through remodels. How can you help with remodels? You can do a lot with remodels. Especially with older schools, you'll see them go through and do a lot of remodels. Big thing with schools when doing remodels is really it's the same as doing new building design, right? From a security consultant's aspect, it depends on the budget, how much I have to work with, and what I can change within the school. If I can replace doors, if I can put up cameras, if I can change front vestibules, check-in areas, if I can put in a man trap at the front vestibule area, how do we lock down the school, stuff like that. We can still consult and design on remodels. It just sometimes you got to be more creative because the building's already there, but you can definitely help and mitigate some of those issues. Someone wrote, has the NFPA 3000 been considered as framework for mitigating active shooters? No, it's not the framework. It's just their way. It's just the NFPA's way of doing things. So it's not really the framework. It's just their method. There's numerous methods out there. Someone else wrote, how do you differentiate between active shooter and mass shooter? So the big difference between active shooter and mass shooter, and that's a good question, is it's that intent again, right? I believe the DOJ and the FBI define mass shooting as three or more casualties or four or more casualties, but that could be a gang shooting, right? That could be a drug deal gone wrong where multiple people are shot. That can be something like that, where an active shooter isn't from a robbery. If three people are shot during a robbery, that's a mass shooting, but it's not an active shooter. It's a robbery gone wrong. So it goes back to that intent, right? Where the only intent of an active shooter is cause as much harm as possible, and that's their sole intent. Thoughts on school resource officers? Some local districts are removing them. Not advised. I think this day and age, if we can have more school resource officers and police officers for school districts, it's great. It just speeds up that response, right? It's also a big deterrent. We know active shooters go the path of least resistance. They're cowards. They're not looking for a fight. If they wanted a fight, they'd go do this at a police station, but they're not. So they're going for the path of least resistance. Removing school resource officers from schools are now opening them up for that path of least resistance. Someone said, please define the acronym Sept that you use. So Sept is crime prevention through environmental design. Does anybody else have anything? I address all those.
Yeah, it looks like that's all for the chat. If someone would like to ask a question, they could unmute themselves and ask it on the mic if they want to do that.
Yeah, hey Ryan, Tad Davis here. One of the things that I didn't hear you mention during the design part of the buildings themselves was anything about the uses of a safe haven. Is that something that you integrate into your design, or is that something that is more of a training issue in terms of teaching people, how to shelter in place while the law enforcement folks arrive on scene to respond?
What do you mean as far as safe haven?
A location that like a safe room where teachers, children could shelter, a designated location on a floor, let's say, where people could go as opposed to just scrambling around, not knowing what to do.
So, yeah, we don't do that. When we're doing training aspects, we don't teach safe haven because you're not always going to be in that one location, right? With schools, we do train lockdowns and lockouts and what the difference is between the two. But when I'm conducting active shooter training, I don't want to teach people to find necessarily a safe haven. Is you want to stick to the concepts and principles, so it doesn't just apply at your workplace or at a school or something like that. It can apply when you're out with your family. So,
Oh,
really, teaching concepts and principles of response is usually a better way to go about it when you're trying to condition people for a response.
thank you.
Yeah, David,
you,
like
Ryan.
your question about
Tony
corridor.
Price said,
I have a question about corridor lengths. What are your thought about how long a corridor ought to be?
Man, I've been in some schools where, I mean, you walk in that main hallway is like a 200-yard hallway, and it's like, oh my gosh, like there's some massive schools. I'm here in Texas, so I've gone in some high schools like in the Houston area where the high school's just massive, and you walk in, those corridors are huge. It's I mean, if you're designing a school or a hospital that is going to serve a large community, you kind of have to have a large structure to serve that. So you see longer corridors and things like that. Um, I don't think it hurts response. If anything else, shooter has to take a longer shot. But now officers, we have to consider law enforcement for the response and also have to travel a greater distance if they're at a far end of a building at a long corridor. Um, I have seen people designing corridors now where I call them wall bumps, where there are places of cover and concealment in those halls in case of an active shooter event. We just need to realize that if we're designing that for people or kids to get behind, the shooter can also get behind it to slow law enforcement response and put effective gunfire on them when they're responding. So you just got to consider different things with corridor design and how we're doing them.
Yeah, Amanda, do you have a question?
Yes, hello. I'm curious if you know of grant programs or communities who have gathered together to fundraise specifically for security design.
Yes, so there are always grants out there. You'll see a lot of federal grants, and there's even some state grants that come out. Like Iowa just released a grant for their schools to do, I think it was for security assessments, but the governor's office put it out, and it's a grant for all the schools to utilize it. There are federal grants usually every year for schools, especially in rural areas that don't have big budget and things like that, to utilize for school safety and school security. What's interesting is the COVID budgets that came out. Schools were able to use some of those COVID grants for school safety in hardening buildings as well. So yes, there's always grants. You just got to find them, just like any other grant. They're out there. We just have to look for them.
Very good, thank you.
Uh-huh.
James, go ahead.
Hey, it's Tony Price. Ryan, do you encounter scopes of work that sort of look at there being a level of response expected that, in your view, doesn't really help you with the design because you have to design for the worst case, not the best case? So do you go have any discussions with clients in terms of, hey, we're expecting our law enforcement and whomever else to be able to do all these things, therefore that's why our scope and budget is set this way for what we want you to do? So you have those kinds of discussions?
Yeah, and you get that a lot. From the consultant side, being a security consultant, it's always a budget thing, and it's always working with them to get more budget to really. And like I said in the beginning, it's always that thing of, well, it won't happen here. We don't need that. It's like, guys, we got to prepare for this. Hope for the best, plan for the worst. And yeah, you have to have those conversations with them because people are still thinking, it won't happen. So yes, all the time I run into those where you have to really work with the client and really talk with them about, and sometimes it's, if you're dealing with bean counters or dealing with like chief legal officers, a lot of times it's, hey guys, you don't do this, liability's huge. There's always a lawsuit after an active shooter event. We got to design safe to mitigate these so you don't have a lawsuit. And then they start kind of understanding when you show them kind of the liability side and the money it could cost them if something does happen, then they kind of start getting it.
Thanks.
Yep.
All right, last chance for Ryan to ask a question before we take off. All right, well, I want to thank you again, Ryan, for joining us today.
Yeah.
And everyone's signed up. Please look out for your PDH hours coming your way, and feel free to join us at one of the events. Check if you don't have access to those, you can see them in the slides, or check out the website at the DC at sme.org/DC post. All right,
Well,
take
thanks.
care, everyone.
Thanks. Hope y'all enjoyed it.
Take care.